And we are live with our 116th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. We are very excited today to have Lewis and Pwnfunction on to talk about Vue.js security stuff and that recent blog post that came out. If you haven't read it, we will link to it here shortly. But always a pleasure to have new faces on. We've rubbed shoulders with Lewis and Pwnfunction in the past at different events. But it's great to have you here. And we'll do introductions shortly. As far as housekeeping items go, apparently I can't talk today, Ken. But as far as housekeeping items go, we have announced the schedule for a Midwinter Nights Con. Let me post that up there really quick. This is a conference that we're running with Abdullah Manawar, Ben Pick, Dave Lintner. We've got a whole bunch of people there. Stefan Edwards are all helping out with this. Logic Hill, people that have been on the podcast in the past. But feel free to sign up. It's a free couple-day event. We'll just be streamed here on our YouTube channel, but very similar to what we did for Midsummer Nights Con. We had a good turnout there and good discussion. We're hoping for the same here. So please go register, go sign up. The only thing you have to give us is an email. We'll just notify you when it starts. I think that's everything that I've got for now, Ken, unless there's something I'm forgetting.
Nope, you're good.
Okay. All right. So let's jump into, actually, let me show this link really quick. There's Midwinter Nights Con link for the registration and all the other information on it. And we are fleshing out some of the talk topics as we get them from different speakers. So that's December 16th and 17th. All right. So Pwnfunction, Lewis, I'm not sure who wants to go first, right? Obviously, the research that came out recently, it's been, a week or so? I guess it's been a few weeks, right? It's been about a month.
I think it's been about a month, yeah.
Yeah. But before we dive into the Vue.js stuff, do you mind doing a quick introduction? Maybe Pwnfunction, we'll start with you. Just tell us a little bit about how you got into the industry. Obviously, we don't want to dox yourself or anything like that if you don't feel like it, but however you want to introduce yourself, what you work on, what you're interested in, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Pwnfunction, or I play the character Pwnfunction, and I'm 22 years old. I'm from India primarily, and I work as a security consultant, independent security consultant, and in my free time, I like to make YouTube videos, mostly. How I got to the industry, I've been always, into hacking and everything, from watching movies and playing games and stuff like that. Over time, I started out as a developer, and then over time, watching movies and everything, I kind of got interested in the security aspect of it because it was more creative, in my opinion. That's how I actually got into the industry.
What do you mean by what bits were more creative? I mean, I think I know, but just for the listeners, I think they might be curious.
Right. Creative in the sense that it's like a free world. You get to break the rules, bend however you want, and then connect things together, which we're not supposed to in the original sense, and then eventually come out. Eventually, you have a result which impacts on a huge scale. So, that's what I mean by when it's creative.
Those are the most fun, when you chain things together and you end up with a nice little exploit. Yeah, pretty cool. Awesome. Should we move on to Lewis?
Sure.
Sweet.
Sure. Make sure I unmute my microphone this time. Before we started, I forgot to mute it, and I was just talking to Seth like, hey, how's it going? And I was like, okay, I'm being ignored. Hi, I'm Lewis Ardern. So I guess from my background is I went to college when I was like, quite young, and when I was doing like an IT technicians class, like repairing computers and stuff. And one of my professors there at the time basically said, like, you should go and do security because you'll make a lot of money. And I was like, well, I guess money's good, and I don't really know what I want to do. So I figured, okay, I'll take a look at that path. And, it ended up not being about the money, but more about the passion and the things that you can do in that type of field, like finding vulnerabilities in systems, understanding how systems work at a very fundamental level is very interesting. And obviously, without having developer experience too, it's very hard to really fundamentally understand that. But I find like, security allows you to kind of, understand and break barriers in certain ways that allow you to get to a higher level of understanding and execution. But so I went to university to do a hacking degree in the UK. And then I went to work at a company that got acquired by NCC. And then I went to go work at Cigital, which then got acquired by Synopsys down in London. And then I ended up moving to the US through Synopsys. And now that's where I still work as an associate principal consultant at Synopsys. My main area of expertise at the moment is primarily like client-side security and modern web security. So looking at frameworks, understanding the client-side, aspects of the browser, all those types of things. And then also, understanding like Node.js, TypeScript, and so on.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, so I guess it makes sense then, Lewis. And with the article that came out, or the blog post that you guys did, and I know there was a couple others that were involved with that as well. But so maybe we can start there if the two of you want to explain, right? Like, what was the impetus to getting started on the Vue.js security side, and then we can dig into the particulars of it.
Yeah, I could probably break down like how I actually got into even looking at the client side stuff, and it kind of coincides with Gareth, and also then obviously bringing in Pwnfunction too. So a long time ago, I used to do a lot of like looking for cross-site scripting, and obviously finding XSS is fun. But then obviously all these new frameworks started to come out, and there was Mario Hedrich, there was Gareth Hayes, and there was all these wonderful researchers that started to look at like AngularJS and the AngularJS sandbox like back in the day. And what kind of obviously was very interesting to me there is because you have all of these new frameworks, and they have some of these what weren't really classed as security protections, or were security protections that were being abused and misused in certain ways. So I guess it started off by looking at so Cure53 created this blog, a GitHub post a while ago on mustache security. And it kind of coincided with me because I was very interested in the topic to go and look at how frameworks are being used. And Cure53 happened to release something on Vue.js. And in their documentation, it says that it's not very interesting to look at from a security perspective because it doesn't really have the things like AngularJS had, like sandboxes and all these different things. So you could just execute arbitrary JavaScript and get eval, new function, move on, it's all done. So that was the kind of core premise of where I started to look into these things, was through mustache security. And they're saying nothing to see here, let's move on. But then obviously you started to look at things like AngularJS, and when Gareth and all those types of people started to release the research into bypassing the sandbox, even though it was technically not a security boundary. But the fact they were fixing it kind of means it was, but at the same time it wasn't. Ultimately led to me to start talking to Gareth about how to improve some of the sandboxes, not sandbox escapes per se, but how to reduce payloads inside AngularJS. So that's kind of where that started to navigate to. And then Gareth and Mario and etc. weren't that interested in looking at Vue, just because it didn't really have much other than you could already execute, an expression with constructor.constructor, and you're done. Because it will automatically render that if it's inside a Vue kind of either component or inside a Vue bound page. So that they were kind of bored with that. But I like to understand how frameworks could potentially be misused at a very certain level, which means ultimately looking at all the different types of things a framework can do and how they could potentially be misused. So this kind of led into obviously I didn't do this, but Google did some research into script gadgets, which ultimately is, if you don't know what a script gadget is, it ultimately is either using some HTML or JavaScript that leverages basically components of a framework that kind of lead you to get to JavaScript execution, which obviously can lead to cross-site scripting, which wouldn't normally happen in a vanilla or generic web application. And then this is kind of where things stemmed from. So Google released Script Gadgets, which was obviously very cool in like 2017. And then basically I started to look at how to improve AngularJS payloads, which then took me down the rabbit hole of looking at how to improve the React payloads, which then coincided with talking to Gareth nonstop. And then we posted the payloads onto Twitter. And then I guess that's kind of where Pwnfunction came into play. So I'm now going to pass it over to Pwnfunction, and he can talk about how he got into it. But that's kind of like where things stemmed from, and Pwnfunction can take it from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Lewis.
Yeah. Yeah, like he said, I joined in because they were posting. I think I saw like Portswigger make a post that they've updated the cheat sheet with Vue.js payloads and stuff. There were only like 3 or 4 of them, and then I had written some code in Vue before. Then I looked at it and I was like, okay, they're missing out a lot of attack surface. Not really attack surface, but like payload surface, you could say. Like they were not using event handlers and stuff like that. So I thought maybe let me do some quick digging and post more payloads so that they can update the cheat sheet. I went around and started finding stuff and then tweeting about it. And eventually we were all going back and forth, posting, shorter and shorter payloads, sort of like having a code golfing competition kind of a thing. And then since we were interested in it, Gareth actually created a group and he added both of us, and we figured out it's better to, use our knowledge collectively and do more research on it, and then maybe do a talk or something. Originally, that was the idea, but since we all got busy, we thought a blog post would do just fine. So, yeah.
Working sort of asynchronously there a bit. Awesome.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that was that we were all on different time zones, and I've never actually spoken to Pwnfunction through audio, so this is the first time this is happening, which is quite surreal for me. But I just want to obviously say, like, I think a lot of the research wouldn't have happened. I used to wake up in the morning, and like Pwnfunction and Gareth, because he's in the UK, were already working on a lot of the things, and I'd wake up and I'd see this like giant DM thread of like all these different payloads and ideas, and I'm just like, guys, I haven't even woken up yet. Like, what's going on? It was like crazy to see like the kind of work that they've done. And obviously, I think this blog post wouldn't have been possible without Gareth and Pwnfunction. It was obviously a collected effort, but Gareth and Pwnfunction are legends. So I was very happy to be part of the journey with them.
Awesome.
You're giving me too much credit.
I don't think so.
It's all about jumping in, right? That's, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting how that works, right? From across the kind of the different time zones perspective. Cause I'm with you, Lewis, right? If I wake up, and I always have this problem with, I'm working with people in Europe or on the East Coast, is I wake up and I see these huge threads and I'm already, 4 hours behind where I need to be, even though I'm just starting my day. It causes me to actually jump in and do probably more than I necessarily would first thing in the morning. It's a good thing, but it's also kind of a stress inducer, at least for me, on, getting stuff done. But anyway, so, it was, that like, I'm reading through the article, but I don't want to give it away too much, right? Like, obviously you've got all the payloads, the XSS cheat sheet that we posted. But yeah, let's dive in a little bit to Vue.js and, what the issues are there and, why it is interesting from that perspective on the client side. I mean, Lewis, you spoke a little bit about it, that initially Vue.js was kind of, I guess, put to the side because it wasn't as interesting, but you kept digging, and now we've got this, the blog post that came about. So what is it that brought you back to it? Was it just the understanding, diving in, or like, did something change within the landscape? What happened there?
So I'll leave part of this for Pwnfunction to answer, but I guess from my perspective, like what so before I started to look at Vue, I was part of a research team with Codoscope, which was acquired by Synopsys as well, and we were looking into like AngularJS and like how the entire ecosystem works, like mapping it out to a certain degree, being able to understand all the dangerous functions, being able to understand, you know, potential dangerous sources and sinks and those types of things. And of course, that kind of correlates to also Vue as well. I didn't obviously do any research with Codoscope and Vue because it was probably pretty premature at the time, because it was AngularJS at the time rather than Angular. Yeah, that led me down the path of like, so I'm really interested in things like blind cross-site scripting. So obviously, like trying to get execution in systems that you generally can't see, like an admin page or like a customer support page or something like that. And obviously, the more people kind of migrate to these, you know, languages and frameworks, you're going to need to use different types of payloads to be able to potentially execute your context. So to give some examples, you know, with some companies are still leveraging, they're migrating from, you know, legacy systems to incorporate new pages, which are kind of bootstrapped with something like Vue or Angular or React and so on. And obviously you want to try and find payloads that, or like execution context that might work in that particular context. So like I did some research into like how you can do blind cross-site scripting in all of the different contexts of AngularJS, because AngularJS has all of these different sandbox escapes. So every payload ultimately was different for the various different versions, which then led to me like, okay, so how can you get execution in Vue as well? So, you know, obviously there's, you know, curly braces, you know, with expressions, but then there's also, you know, basically script gadgets, which allow you to leverage components of the framework itself. So looking at directives, looking at all these different things. So what I spent some time doing was reading all of the documentation that is obviously accessible on Vue, which was Vue 2.0 at the initial time before Vue 3 was released. And we started to look at how you could leverage some of the either like the shorthand syntax or shorter directives that would allow you to get a shorter execution context, because there's been very interesting kind of scenarios I've been, because I, you know, am a pen tester by trade, or not much anymore, because I do a lot of code review these days compared to pen testing. But yeah, so when I do pen testing, sometimes there are scenarios where, you know, the input box only accepts arbitrary amount of numbers, or sorry, a subset of characters. And if you're trying to use something like what was an AngularJS payload, which was massive, like if you think about 1.5.9 that was found by, I believe the guys works now at Google, it was about this big compared to like if you could find a payload about this big, then it would be able to be accepted in a lot more attack vectors from a dynamic, you know, black box perspective. So that's kind of where I was going with it to begin with. But then I think it's really important for like when people start to leverage these frameworks, you need to understand it as someone who's going to be reviewing them as a security practitioner. You need to know the framework and you need to understand what's going on, which is why looking at the documentation, trying to take a look at the source code to some degree, which obviously is documented in the blog post, kind of takes you down a path of being able to get shorter payloads, you know, things that might be used, and so on. So that's kind of like where I was going. There's obviously more I could say, but I'll pass it over to Pwnfunction to add anything you might want to add.
Yeah, sure. So like he said, it is useful in the context of blind XSS and stuff like that, but also in certain scenarios, bypassing CSP would be important, such as, let's say, there are websites who are allowing only specific domains, or you know, they're strictly not allowing any sorts of unsafe evals, any of that matter. The main thing,
so like script source or default source or any of those types of CSP directives that limit certain resources being loaded from sites, you're just like needing to bypass that.
Vue.js does require unsafe eval. That's a good thing for hackers, at least. But let's say you're not allowed to directly inject any JavaScript using script tags or image src or any of that. But in some cases, when there's a Vue.js library within the website, you have access to it. You can use these script gadgets to, essentially get JavaScript execution, or basically XSS at the end of the day. What we've gone through the entire blog post is that we've listed out all possible ways that we could find, and also the length of them, like shorter ones and smaller ones and whatever that is. So yeah. Also, I think we touched upon mutation XSS a bit on the blog post, and that was mostly tricking the Vue.js compiler to parse the tags differently, or it just acts weird. But anyways, it's primarily used for bypassing CSPs, and that's mostly it, I guess.
There was one other thing that we did find as well, that because of the mutation, you could bypass things like web application firewalls, and at some point there is a potential use case of bypassing sanitizers too, because ultimately you're going to have some valid-looking HTML that shouldn't really be, anything should be removed. But when you get it mutated by Vue, because it's transforming it in a particular way, you could potentially leverage it to bypass things like a sanitizer, or, as we did show in the blog post, that you could also use it to bypass things like a WAF, because that's a very unique case. Like, there's not many frameworks that actually mutate. Sometimes, obviously browsers, have closing tags that automatically close for you, but this was like creating brand new, properties that shouldn't really exist in a generic way. And this was only happening due to Vue. Now, I'm going to post something because it's kind of important to obviously document, a lot of the work that we did. And obviously the creator of Vue kind of commented on it. And obviously I think it was obvious to myself and Gareth and Pwn, but some people who haven't looked at the framework before, they like Evan Yu, and I'll just say, he says, reference to our paper, it says, to clarify, everything outlined in this article is based on the assumption that you're allowing arbitrary third-party code injection into your Vue templates, which is the #1 thing we warn against in our security docs. Obviously, my argument there is that just because it's in the security docs doesn't mean people are going to follow it. And if you're not doing things like what Angular does, like ahead-of-time compilation, compared to what's happening in the components that we were looking at in Vue, it's obviously going to happen. It's inevitable. So like if you think of I'll paste a JS fiddle, which people can take a look at. And like this is what I class as like a silent sync, where you're basically leveraging like jQuery.text, which technically by default is going to do output encoding. But in like a framework like Vue, it's going to ultimately lead to cross-site scripting. And this is because of the way it's basically, taking that expression and evaluating it. So this won't happen in things like Angular 2 and above because of like things like ahead-of-time compilation. But due to the way things like Vue works, this is a potential concern. So like just because it's in the security documents doesn't mean it's actually going to not happen in these applications, is what I'm trying to say.
So to clarify, are they saying like if I wanted to include a third-party JavaScript file for a marketing widget or something like that in my code, or for a payment related like Stripe or something like that, and I'm including that into the Vue.js, and then that's the essentially considered the arbitrary third-party code?
I think it's anywhere where input could be treated as potentially code, I guess, is what they're trying to say. I don't know.
Seems like a lot.
Yeah, I mean that's what I mean. It's very hard to say. Like just because like it doesn't have to directly be in the template itself. It can just be like if you bind something inside a divider and the injection point is inside that divider, it's ultimately going to lead to potential things like cross-site scripting. So obviously, if you do like HTML entities, in I guess that's in PHP, right? And that doesn't think of curly braces in this context. So curly braces aren't HTML special characters, which would then take you down a path of XSS through Vue.js, for example. It would be the same in Angular, for example, but it wouldn't be in something that already has ahead of time compilation. It doesn't really happen in React because of the way I think it's the rendering engine works, or it's just a small library and it doesn't do that type of things. There were issues in the past which you could kind of create React properties which could take you down a path of adding things like dangerously set in a HTML, but you can't do that anymore. So like there's only really 2 frameworks I think have these types of issues at the moment from what I've seen. I'm sure there are more, but the popular ones, which is obviously AngularJS, which is going to die soon. It's going to end of life is 2021, 2020, around that time. And then obviously there's Vue.js. So all I was trying to say is that just because it's said, in the security documentation that this is the one thing you shouldn't do, doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's the same like you shouldn't add input into a dangerous set in a HTML, but it happened for Signal. You shouldn't add bypass security trust, but I've seen that happen thousands of times by developers. Like just because there are, dangerous APIs there doesn't mean people aren't going to leverage them in an insecure way. So.
Yeah, and doesn't that kind of mean that just basically any user input, which will inevitably be reflected back on the page, is now considered untrusted third-party code in a way?
No, not necessarily. I mean, if it's going in, for example, if you're doing it the Vue way, then it's very unlikely that you're going to have this issue. It's when you start to use either another third-party library, which could then ultimately lead to something like that, or if you're just doing things in a very kind of taking like a legacy application which already has things like JSP, kind of things embedded or whatever, then you could go down that path. But I think if you're doing things like from the ground up in Vue, it would be very unlikely to find XSS in this particular way. I don't know if Pwnfunction has a different thought on that, but I feel like if you're doing it the Vue way or if you're doing it the Angular way, it's very unlikely that these things are going to happen. But obviously, there still is the edge cases.
So this ahead of time compilation, just one last question on that. This is not included in Vue, but is this the reason why unsafe inlines required? Is it because they cannot generate nonces for that code, and then print it out on the page and have that included in? I mean, is it just
So I think that I think Vue needs unsafe eval, not unsafe inline. So
that's what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's because I think they call new function, which obviously is dynamic execution. So they call basically properties, which would be classes and evaluation, right? Is that right? Pwnfunction.
Yes. They use the function constructor, I believe. So they use the new function to generate the string to actual JavaScript code at the end from the templates. So they're actually using unsafe eval to do that. But there's an option to do the other way around as well, like the ahead of time compilation is also an option to do. But it's if you're generally just using it as a library via the let's say a source script tag, you just include the library and then just cram in some templates to work with. In that kind of scenarios, it does use the unsafe eval part to generate the code.
That is true. Yeah, obviously, I guess I'll rephrase what I just said. So by default, it doesn't have AOT. But if you have things like Angular, where you basically release the prod, just do the -- prod flag, and that's normally embedded in most applications, it automatically does AOT for you. So it's very unlikely that that's going to happen in a framework like Angular. I'm not saying it's better. I'm really not saying it. Both of the security properties, which are automatically embedded in Vue and Angular, are very good. They obviously just have different features. But by default, obviously, if you're just what Pwnfunction said is basically if you're just using it out the box, embedding it as a JavaScript library, and then creating some components with it, then you might go down a path of having potential expressions or script gadgets potentially being abused inside your application. Obviously, it's very slim from a ground-up application, but not everyone builds from ground up. Sometimes they're incorporating from different teams, which may be leveraging other components and so on.
Yeah, when I looked this up, the first few things I saw were GitHub comments saying that the unsafe eval is only needed for the full version of Vue.js, but the runtime version doesn't need it. That's what I was reading. This is an interesting problem because it really is very much how you use it. And I know you guys are going to talk about it, but it's pretty interesting. They're using this new, creating new functions on the fly. So we talk about, Seth, we talk about metaprogramming, writing code, and the vulnerabilities that introduces, especially with dynamic variables being user input. And to me, this reads like another crafty way of doing that. So far. That's awesome. But yeah,
so I think
without giving it away, sorry, go ahead.
So I'll probably let Pwnfunction talk about that more. But I think one interesting thing that we found through the code golfing is that they had like these particular scope properties that you could use, which ultimately led to accessing the function constructor. So like that's the reason why in version 2 we were able to access like things like _C, _B, because they had these kind of properties that were accessible inside the application, which kind of led us to be able to make smaller payloads through that usage. But I'll let Pwn talk more about the kind of, the internals of our view.
Was that the actual underscore library?
No. So
the underscore notation.
The underscore notation of definitions.
For example, _C is for creating components. It's like a Vue.js internal function that is used to create components, I believe, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, it's been over a month since I've looked at that. Like we finished the research before we wrote the blog post, so it's kind of like it's been some time since we've actually looked at it. And like the research wasn't we didn't really think of it as like trying to find script gadgets to begin with. It was really just like we want to see like what kind of quirky things that can happen inside Vue. And then it basically, when we were finished with all the work, it was like, oh, actually, this is all about script gadgets. So like that's kind of why. Like the kind of blog post became what it was, but we were really just interested in like to seeing like how much code golfing we can do, how much research we can do in the actual framework itself. Maybe we can find a way to execute JavaScript with inside the actual like rendering aspect of it, which obviously we didn't get anywhere with that because the way it's done, it's not really possible from what we could see. But there's so much more research that we could have done, and we would like Pwnfunction and I and Gareth were talking about it. Like we haven't looked at things like server-side rendering, we haven't looked at like any of the other. We didn't really look at routing. We didn't really look at like anything to do with the like kind of additional things that come with Vue, which are still maintained by the Vue maintainers. So there are tons of things that could be done still.
You look like you. This research seems like you're going down the path of one specific category, but yeah, it definitely does seem like there's probably a lot more to get into. But yeah, it's just funny that you say that, like a month or two is like you completely mem dumped it, because I'm glad to hear that, because I feel like I say that all the time. Like people are like, hey, you just looked at this app 2 or 3 weeks ago and they have questions, and I'm always like, I don't know, that was might as well have been 10 years ago. Honestly, I just dump it the second it's over. It's funny to hear y'all say that too.
I mean, there are things that you still remember. Like there's certain pen tests that I do where I can still tell you everything that's going on with it, and it's more like if it's a more interesting project to me. But like these research type things are like really like they're kind of pretty overwhelming, I think, in some regards. And when something's overwhelming and you finally get it and you're done, it's like release, and it just kind of like disappears. But I mean, obviously, there's still lots of things that we could have done, and we would like to in the future. And it doesn't need to be Vue. There could be other frameworks that we might want to take a look at. But Vue obviously it just kind of originated due to that initial kind of thing about the. I guess it started with Angular JS payloads and then kind of migrated over to Vue.
Nice, yeah.
Cool.
I feel like I cut Pwnfunction off though, so I should let you interject. Sorry.
Sorry, I don't think I heard that.
So I wanted Pwnfunction because he did a lot of the research on things like teleport and kind of how you adapted the payloads to the version 3 and those types of things. So basically when we started to look at Vue, it was written in version 2. And then when we were going through the research, version 3 came out in beta, I think. And then I think Gareth and Pwnfunction primarily looked at those types of things. But what were the kind of interesting things that you found when you were looking at the teleport stuff and some of the mutation stuff?
Right. So initially, I think we focused primarily on code golfing payloads, who gets the shortest version. And eventually, I think Gareth started to look at mutation XSS and things of that nature, but I was more interested in what the Vue.js, the framework itself, offers, such as its features, such as view directives and things like that. So we eventually got around figuring out all of that features, and one of the cool ones were teleport, which basically lets you teleport some part of code into a let's say you have some code that you want to teleport into a div tag. You can do that, like open a portal on one side and have another one on the other side. Just target it by giving a query selector, and it will just automatically put that code in there. So the Vue.js does that all by itself. And it was interesting because, so let's say you have, I'm not sure it worked on script tags. Did it work on script tags? I've forgotten it.
I think it may have, but
I'm pretty
I would
sure.
have to double check.
But I'm pretty sure it worked on style tags. So you have like a style tag, which is only, which is outside the scope of the Vue root div or the root component. What you can do is use teleport to jump out of it and push code to other HTML tags, such as, let's say, style tags. And it could be interesting for style tags, because you can make, let's say, arbitrary requests by using background URLs and things like that. It's one potential way of compromising the application in certain ways. But the thing is, Vue.js had a whole lot of cool features. There was even at some point reverse teleporting, which is, I don't think it's not really documented or anything. I was just looking over the source code and I came across the weirdness, and I was debugging it, and eventually got to a point that, okay, this works, right? So yeah, there was a lot of undocumented kind of things as well. But in the end, Vue.js has a lot of features. In good situations, you can leverage them and exploit it to the fullest, I guess.
Very cool. And I popped up on the screen just sort of the proof of the walkthrough and the proof of concept that you had listed on the article for teleport, where it shows. So that's the query, or that's the attribute selector, I assume, the div tag that you're going to want to send this data to, like this bold test. The contents of the tag are transferred to text nodes. Decode and transfer works. This works for script, style, and elements. There's your proof of concept. So that's kind of crazy. You can actually just manipulate elements on the page through this tag. Huh.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I mean, personally as a developer, I'm trying to figure out, okay, the teleport function, where I would be actually using that, right?
I think one good place for that would be meta tags. If you create a view or
Makes
any front-end application, you have like a root div, and inside that you have to put all the code in there. All the component goes in there, but you're not directly allowed to access the head tag and put meta tags or whatever. In that case, maybe you're allowed to jump out of it, or even creating modules and things like that. You might have problems having, isolating it to a specific container. Sometimes you want to go outside of it. So in that case, teleport might be useful.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I can see that. I mean, I can see the function. It does. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like from a danger perspective, it does feel pretty dangerous because it is metaprogramming, right? At some level, you're injecting code from one portion of the app into another portion and then running it.
It's for dark mode, Seth. That's why.
It's for dark mode. That's yeah, I'm sure it is, right? I'm sure you could use it that way. Reverse teleport. That's awesome.
Yeah, I was reading about that, trying to understand that too.
That was the undocumented.
Oh, the undocumented.
Yeah.
I think it's also because version 3 is still relatively new. So there's probably a lot of features that haven't really been truly documented that are going to be leveraged to a certain degree. I don't know if it's like fully out of beta yet, but like last time we were looking at it, it was still like you had to go to like a different website to access the v3 docs kind of thing and all that kind of stuff. So it was still relatively fresh in everyone's mind, and it was still, I don't like it. It was like on a separate, I don't know if it was on a separate GitHub, but it was definitely separated from what was the current latest version. Which was like V2 something. Yeah.
I mean, and part of what I dig about the research, right, and what you guys have done here is that, you know, it is very code review centric. Ken and I talk about that a lot, and I know, Lewis, you're doing a lot of that as well. But the fact that the security issues that were identified all come from, hey, we combed through the code of actually what's running Vue and noticed this, this, and this, and then we're actually able to dynamically execute those payloads and those functions, right? I don't know about you, but at times I get pushback on the whole code review on, oh, well, you could just run, you know, Veracode or whatever in a static analysis tool, and, you know, it would find anything that would be potentially dangerous. But there's no way that that static analysis tool would have picked up like this function call and how that execution is happening, because it is like, yeah, I mean, the way that it's generating the content and what's dynamic and custom versus what's not, like there's just so many variables there. The attack surface is huge on these frameworks, and we don't think about a lot of times because it's like, oh, well, they're just importing Vue or they're importing React or whatever, so we're going to trust that and we're just going to look at the custom code. That's a lot of what I see.
Yeah, I mean, when we first started to look at the Angular stuff a long time ago, when I used to be on the research team, I was told by my mentor, David Johansson, to basically try and build a miniature threat, not even a miniature threat model, try and threat model AngularJS, because that's going to allow you to, like, not even like, you know, how an applicant developer would use it, but how it's actually like the internals, and, you know, like how does the sanitizer work? How do they all kind of correlate together? And those types of things, and then potentially think of some pitfalls there. And then you probably could do a code review to kind of, you know, argument if that's actually going to be secure or not. The same for, I guess you could do it with some of the Vue components too. We didn't do that obviously in the research. It was more like we needed to understand how things worked, and we wanted to take a look at the code to kind of leverage that. We spent a long time trying to find arbitrary code execution in the kind of, you know, rendering aspect of like when it was taking a template and trying to kind of convert it into its particular syntax, but there was just no way after looking at the code that would have been possible. If people do want to kind of get into like understanding like how to do that, I remember Gareth Hayes wrote a very amazing AngularJS like sandbox escape thing on the Portswigger blog, which basically, if I could actually find it, but basically it kind of went through like how he like ripped through the code to be able to understand how the sandbox functions worked, which led him to be able to bypass it. Which, let me just see if I can find it. Yeah, I think it's this one. This one. There's two blog posts that I know are really good, so I guess I'll just share them out anyway. And obviously this is not related to Vue, but they, you know, kind of coincide together. But basically in one of those blog posts, he goes into detail about like how, you know, where you would put the line breaks in the code, where you would, I mean, if they're both wrong, then I'm sorry. There's two of them that obviously will be posted. But there's two researches that he did, and one which basically really documented how you would breakpoint the Angular code, how you would step through it, and then how you would make changes to the functions to be able to execute, you know, what you wanted to do. And obviously, I think that understanding like how Gareth did that probably would take you on the journey of being able to like research something like Vue and being able to understand how those components worked as well. So that's kind of why I really wanted to work with Gareth on something as well, because it's just some of the research that he did back in the day was, you know, phenomenal. And the same with like watching like Pwnfunction explain videos the way he does on his YouTube video. It's very easy to understand different types of issues when someone understands the topic very well. So
yeah,
you know.
We did link to his YouTube channel as well for folks. But yeah, this is it's interesting because I'm looking at the payload for that Gareth put together, and yeah, it looks like it's using that constructor of a constructor to build that function object. So that's pretty interesting.
So normally,
Which is what you show. Sorry.
No, you're good. So I guess like Pwnfunction can stop me if I say anything wrong, but obviously you want to get access to the function constructor because it kind of gives you access to all, things JavaScript. So you have access to alert, you have access to pretty much everything that you would want to do. So normally you try and access, you access a constructor, and then you access the function constructor, then be able to access things like alert and, whatever you wanted to do and so on. So, and obviously that can be done through many ways. And depending on where you are in the code or where you find an injection, like you might have to go like multiple levels up until you reach the function constructor. Did I say anything wrong there, Pwn? Or you can definitely jump in and say if I said.
No, I think it's correct. Yeah, you use the constructor and then use the constructor again to get the function constructor to eval any code. Basically, will convert any string to actual JavaScript. And the way that it runs is in the context of window object. So you have access to alert and everything else. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I have a question not related necessarily to the technical aspects of this, but more so, it's not every day that we get a chance to talk to researchers that do this sort of in-depth research on a specific framework for a specific classification of vulnerabilities. So there are a couple of questions that I basically had, like, for instance, how disciplined are you in your note taking? What's your process like in this? Just sort of like I'd love to just go behind the scenes about what it's like while you're knee deep in these projects, like how you go about tracking what effort you're doing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Sure. So the way that we take notes is, at least for this research, was just Google Docs. Whatever we find interesting, we'll just take a note of them right then and there, or else we'll forget about it. And we did extensive kind of research around the tooling, what we can use, or the tools that are available for developers, such as Vue template compiler and Vue DevTools, all that sort of thing that makes us, makes our the entire process of research a lot easier. So with all the tools and everything, and using the tools that are available from the browser itself, such as DevTools and everything, we basically step through the code and also at the same time look at the code, because usually whatever you're stepping through, it doesn't make sense because everything is just minified and it doesn't make any literal sense. As a reference, since it's an open source project, we'll have the code at the other side and sort of map through everything and try to get like a basic understanding of what's actually happening on a high level, and then just tweak little things and take notes at the same time. Okay, so for this, it behaves like this, and things like that. So as far as tooling, it's just Google Docs, we just take straight up notes. I think Lewis will add any more points to that.
I think at the beginning, it's always organization by chaos. There was like so many things going on in that document that like I was like looking at some things and like writing, there were components to it. Like we were asking questions like, what if we could do X? And then you would either come to a conclusion that you couldn't do it. But to get to that point, like there was like things everywhere. Like Gareth was putting things in one component. Like looking at the source code, I was looking at the documentation to understand how different things worked. Pwn was kind of doing a correlation of everything, and then we were all jumping into the code. So yeah, it was I think organization by chaos that kind of gets stringed together like a puppet, and then eventually it can like move around. So that's kind of like where I imagine things going. But when I'm doing like my own personal projects, I think obviously like if anyone's going to start looking at something, I think you have to build as well. So I think we were spending a lot of time like actually utilizing utilizing Vue to kind of understand like how it actually fundamentally worked, and then like building simple applications to kind of leverage how things might actually kind of execute. And then obviously I like to look more dynamically to begin with. and then jump into, looking at source. But, some people like to work backwards too. So I normally like to look at, okay, so I'm doing these things dynamically. I can see these things getting rendered. I can start adding breakpoints on what I think is actually doing the rendering process. What's happening here, step through the breakpoints to try and understand what's going on. And then when things aren't clear, jump to the source code. That's kind of how I normally, depending on how you're doing it, but from a dynamic perspective, it's sometimes easy, some people will probably argue, but I find it easier to visually map a dynamic usage because you're actually seeing it versus okay, these are all the routes that are happening and so on. So, and it's harder when it's a framework rather than a generic application, which has app.post and so on. You can follow, post routes, but this is super internal stuff where you're there's 15,000 calls here. I have no idea what's going on. So.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Mapping out any sort of library framework versus a web app, right? That has app.post, app.get, or you can run rake routes against, right, Ken? It's a different beast when that's actually turned on you. And I spend a lot of time in API documentation at that point, right? What's actually exposed, what are the public functions that are accessible, how would a developer use those, as opposed to, hey, I'm just just looking at the custom code. So it's interesting. I mean, I'm drawing some parallels with some assessments and some other things that we're doing. And I think that's what Ken's getting at as well, is kind of that information gathering. You spend a lot of time going down rabbit holes that don't end up anywhere, right? You almost get used to disappointment, right?
Yeah, a lot of the things I actually wrote didn't make it into the blog post, which obviously I'm not. I mean, it's not I don't feel hurt about that, but there was so much information there anyway. So there was tons of things that we did work on which just didn't make it into the document because it was so big. When it was reviewed by James Carroll, etc. It was just some things have to go.
Yeah, no, I was actually just more curious about the research process in general. I didn't realize it mimicked a review. I mean, it makes sense, right? It does make sense that would mimic the some parts of the assessment process in terms of the upfront, looking at documentation, looking through the use cases, building with, if I had the luxury of doing that with everything that was new, not luxury, I shouldn't say that, but time-wise, I mean, it is sort of a, if someone gave you 3 weeks before you start an assessment to learn something, that would be quite nice, right? But it never happens that way. But that would be nice if you could just build something before you go and test it. But again, rarely happens. But yeah, it is curious because I was trying to see, what parallels to draw there. But that's interesting. And what would you, some folks watching this who maybe they've not, dove into research before, any tips that you can provide, any sort of guidance or input, or just anything that you can think that maybe someone could have told you before you started getting into research and doing research that you could pass on to someone else?
I'll let Pwnfunction talk first. I think he probably has a few things to say.
Not really. When it comes to research, I'm just a mess. So I don't think I've got good points on that. Maybe Lewis can start off, and then maybe I could take detour and stuff.
Okay. I mean, obviously, I think so. If I was going to do research first, I would avoid code first. Don't look at the code. Don't be daunted by the massive amounts of hundreds of thousands of lines of code that have been written over many years to build this, wonderful, now widely used framework. Just first start building and understanding how the functions are and how everything works and how things are expected to work. And then kind of start to question okay, so I see that they are doing output encoding here, but where are the places they don't do output encoding? What could be a potential security issue that I could go and hunt for and maybe try and find. That's kind of how I would approach it as someone. And when I first started to look at it, I was going to the documentation. I was then clicking open source and then trying to understand what was going on. And there's just no way that you're going to get to a point, especially if you're new and you haven't looked at frameworks before, or even just written code. I'm not a developer by trade. I have done development in the past. I used to be a .NET developer before I got into security. But I would say that my trade isn't primarily, writing code every single day. So it's very hard for me to get into the mindset of like, I can review code to a certain level. There are certain frameworks and languages that I'm very comfortable in, like JavaScript and TypeScript, and I'm starting to get more into .NET Core. But like if it was written in something else, it's going to be nearly impossible for me to just be able to assume that I'm going to be able to understand those types of issues. So or understand like even how the functions are working. So I would normally build the app, try and look at it dynamically, and then jump into source once you're a bit more comfortable with how everything's working. And then obviously jumping on like the mailing list, for example, for those particular working groups, because like, if there's an Angular team or if there's, a Vue team, I'm sure, I don't know about Vue, we didn't do this in our research, but when I was first looking into Angular, I used to jump on the weekly steering committee. I believe it was on Google Mail or Google, whatever the kind of like threads that are on Google, and it used to have all of like the kind of like what they're working on, new features. And then obviously you could then start to think about, okay, they're introducing these features, could they be abused from a security perspective? And like those are the kinds of things that you might want to do as a researcher. But I think I'm the same as Pwnfunction. I'm pretty chaotic in my note taking. I'm pretty chaotic in my work. But I think building at least gives me the mental mind map to understand what's going on, and then being able to go, okay, so I know that it's calling this function. Let's go take a look at that before it's been transpiled or if it's been minified or obfuscated in some way, and then trying to find a different medium to find issues.
I think
that's
I
awesome.
like to.
That's super helpful. Sorry.
All right, so I'll add a little bit. I guess whatever he said, I have the exact same kind of thing with it. Basically, approach maybe breadth first. Just try to look at how the framework works on a high level. Just play around with it. Get to know the features. Be close with the community. Also, one cool place you could visit and probably a potentially worth place to start a research would be GitHub issues. You look at other people's issues, and most often than not, you'll find something weird that will take you down a rabbit hole. Eventually, you might find something that's interesting. That has happened to me quite often. So just wanted to add that one as well.
We'll send you your check for mentioning GitHub issues in the mail. And no, that's awesome. Well, what's interesting is it's not a combative relationship at all from the research side. In fact, it's the opposite. You're both of you, and that surprised me, not in any way other than that's awesome to hear that you all worked with that team and recommend hopping on the Google forums, into the Slack, whatever the team's using to communicate. That is, for me personally, an interesting takeaway, which I think is great. Usually, or not usually, I should say, like there is this feeling sometimes of like the research community and the development community maybe being at odds, but that's not the case. It is very much like, you need the security research for the product to be good. So I love to see that you all are interacting in that way and recommending that for other researchers. Super cool.
Yeah. So I would say I probably haven't really communicated directly through those channels, but I have been obviously using them to, sometimes actually I have raised a few questions. I did raise some questions about the AngularJS documentation back in the day. This was quite a few years ago now. And I was like talking to some of the people that were working on that team through those channels. But like for now, like especially if you're new, you're probably not going to be asking questions because you're probably going to feel like you're going to ask a dumb question. So again, like ultimately, people just tend not to ask questions, but actually just reading like how people are wording things, seeing like how they intend to implement things can give you like that kind of like spark to kind of go, oh yeah, actually, like if that kind of does go that way, then this could be a potential security concern. Obviously, there was the interesting research in the past. So that there's a few things that I've seen recently through GitHub, actually, which is quite interesting. So if you take a look at Mario's AngularJS, like the abusive relationship of AngularJS talk, you'll see that how he leverages GitHub to basically fixing one issue that opens up a bigger issue kind of thing, which was very interesting from an attack scenario. It's obviously it got fixed, and I don't think they were too happy about it, but it's a very interesting talk. But the one thing which I saw, which kind of I know GitHub introduced like the security thing where you can like directly report issues through security, but DOM Purify, which is obviously a very popular client-side sanitizer these days, someone actually like just on the issues page just published a bypass like for the late like 2.2.1 or something like that, and like it was like, and they were like, oh crap, maybe you should do this by email next time. But like that's a very like, so like it's true what Pwnfunction said, because I've been to the issues page of many third-party libraries in the Node.js ecosystem and just found like an arbitrary like payload that was like included in the GitHub issues kind of thing, and that was obviously before security page was introduced. But it was just very interesting to see, because there's been numerous times where I found so many bugs just by looking at GitHub issues.
I'm smiling because there were two things we recommend. So, Seth and I do this code review course, but two of the things we recommend and actually do in each assessment is when you've got a new code base you're looking at, new to you anyways, is going through the issues and looking for your broadest, most critical, like SSRF, SQL injection, XSS, security, just as searching for security, whatever it may be, to see what may be there. And that lends itself to like, so for instance, if you find a vulnerability in one, like let's say it's an org and you find a vulnerability in one code base, maybe it's a similar type of vulnerability that could be present in their other code bases. So that's always an interesting one. And then the other thing is like doing a little bit of git commit message spelunking for those same types of issues. So like, doing parsing through the git log for like CSRF or SQL injection or whatever. So it's interesting that you say that, because it very much mimics the same thing as like an assessment and some of the things we recommend. That's super funny, but that's always really helpful. Like doing that. Like I think we call it like what is it called? Like historical, I forget what it's called, but it's like historical.
Oh, app archaeology? I don't know.
App archaeology.
Something like that, right? Like,
yeah.
It's about just like getting to know what's going on. Sorry, Lewis, go ahead.
No, you're good. The interesting thing there is like at least with the DOM Purify thing is that they did modify the message, but because obviously it has a commit history, you can just go up and find the actual payload that was used for that particular issue. So that was like super funny to me. Like I was just like, because like there's like I use a particular mail provider that actually uses DOM Purify, and I was like, I don't like that idea of this being like leaked to the public. But yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, DOM Purify is an awesome library. Highly recommend.
Yeah, well, guys, we've been going for a good hour. We want to be cognizant of your time because you've been so gracious to come on and talk to us today. Is there I'm trying to figure out how to put a bow on all this. I mean, basically it's go do research, right? But if you want to take another minute or so, any recommendations or anything else that you'd like to promote, what's next for you before we wrap things up for today? Lewis, you want to start?
Let's get Pwnfunction to start, because I feel like I've been talking way too much.
Sure. Wait. I'm not sure I understood the question. There were multiple parts for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just anything you want to end the episode on, and anything. Sure. Sometimes this isn't such the case now because nobody's traveling at all. But we used to be like, hey, are you speaking anywhere? Are you gonna be anywhere anyone can talk to you? And these days, obviously, it's no. Yeah. But anything else, blog posts, research, anything you want to leave people with, anything you want to talk about?
Sure. When it comes to the Vue.js, of course, the cheat sheet, and I think we left out a lot of surface for research. There's a lot more to look into. I really want people to look more into this. Start off with the blog post that we have, and maybe see what are the things that have changed, and maybe look at how we primarily didn't look at the router or the Vuex or the server-side rendering, any of that stuff. That's a huge part to look into. I really hope people do look into that. And yes, originally I thought I would make a video on this, but there's a great blog post out there already, so I wouldn't really go about redoing the same thing. But yeah, that's all for me. I'll be making more videos. That's all.
Cool. All right, Lewis.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would just, if I was going to say anything, just make sure you stay curious, because there have been days where, like, it's the same with like when people start doing bug bounties or whatever. Like anything when you start trying to do security research on something, even depending on how you look at it, is it security research open to interpretation? But people get burnt out very quickly because they don't find anything, and we didn't expect to find anything with the Vue stuff. I mean, I knew I would because I was working with Gareth and Pwn, so I was pretty confident we were going to find something. But obviously we already knew issues existed because of obviously it already allowed for reflection of expressions and so on. So maybe so some of the work that's been done recently in the research community, such as James Kettle, when they were doing like cache poisoning and stuff, that was like work that was already done in the past. So I mean, obviously, just like seeing research get released, don't assume that that's going to be the end of research. Try and take something that someone's already done and see if you can improve it. Like there are tons of amazing blog posts that kind of like expand upon what someone else has done. It's the same for you should definitely take a look at Vue and expand on the work that we've done. The same for don't assume a framework has completely been reviewed just because it's been looked at by one person. There's always going to be bugs. It's the same for like bug bounties, the same for looking at systems. If someone pokes at GitHub one day, it's the same with if you look at the XSS issue that got Live Overflow basically released about Google.com, Google DE, which had the mutation XSS. That was that issue didn't exist until they'd made code changes, and then it got released and pushed, and then they already had a check for that particular issue, but somehow it got lost, and then they were able to get XSS on Google.com, which was huge. But just because that issue wasn't there before doesn't mean it's not going to potentially occur in the future. So always monitoring things you're interested in, seeing changes to the code and so on will obviously take you down a potential path of finding issues. Is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
it's a very good video too. I guess we could link that.
Sure. Yeah, well, like I said, we appreciate you coming on, taking time out of your day to give us a little bit of insight into your process, and then also everything Vue.js related, right? It's been, it's always good to see how people are, doing their research and jumping into all of the things. So, Ken, any final thoughts then before we wrap up today?
I love Lewis's what looks to be the Bay Area OWASP.
It is, yeah. So I'm one of the organizers for OWASP Bay Area, and ultimately, this was given to me just before COVID hit. So it's been in my apartment this entire time, and this is the first time I pulled it out of storage. So, it's nice to have it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I thought that was cool. But no, sorry. Besides that, no, yeah, great episode. Thank you for your time and for coming on and sharing this information with folks and for putting out this research. It's not a small thing that you all do and contribute, and it's very valuable. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Well, yeah, we will get this episode up and posted. We'll put your Twitter handles up there, all that kind of stuff, so people can reach out if they have other questions. Otherwise, thanks everyone today for joining us. As always, get involved with the conversation, get involved with research. Join us on Slack, join us on Twitter. We love talking about this kind of stuff. So reach out, and hopefully we'll see everyone again. I can't remember if next week. So we'll be back on.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Later.
Thanks.